This playlist collects together and organizes the individual component modules, which together comprise our lecture covering Moore's article, Proof of an External World. We'll begin our discussion by talking a little bit about who Moore was. Then we'll turn our attention to discussing Moore's conception of philosophy and his approach to practicing philosophy. And I think it's important that we get a little clearer on this notion and this practice before we start talking about the paper itself. I think when contemporary students read Moore, they find Moore to be eerily familiar in how he approaches philosophy and yet strangely alien. And I think this is a very natural response. Moore practices and conceives of philosophy in a way that is pretty strongly different, both from the historical figures that you typically read and from the contemporary figures that you typically read. And so a better understanding of Moore's approach helps us to get a better comprehension of the paper itself. With that in hand, we'll then turn our attention to the issue that Moore spends most of the paper dealing with, the analysis of the notion associated with the phrase, things outside us. Once we have an understanding of Moore's analysis of this notion, then we'll turn to his proof. And many people would focus on the proof itself, taken really in some sense out of the context of what has preceded the proof. And I take a quite different approach. My approach will be to view Moore's proof as merely a performative crescendo, a demonstrative of the ideas that had already been established in the earlier part of the paper. In fact, in some ways, the proof itself makes the paper less easily comprehensible to people, makes it seem more outrageous than it actually probably really is. We'll end the lecture by turning our attention to Moore's defense of the proof, both in terms of his offering up of a set of criterion for what would count as a successful proof, as well as his defense of the project in wider philosophical terms. It's in the discussion of these broader issues at the end of the lecture that I think the payoff and the motivation for looking at this article really comes into view for us in terms of the class itself. We've been puzzling over this question about where epistemic justification comes from. We've looked at empiricists that claim it comes from direct sensory experience. We've looked at rationalists who claim that at least important parts of it come through rational intuition. We've seen that almost everyone supposes in a very unproblematic fashion that justification can be transferred, a la inference, from one belief that has that justification to the next. And what we'll see when we start to consider this section of the paper is that those ideas are really much more ethereal than we thought. Moore seems to have some sort of notion about how it is that he gets to know things that isn't rational intuition per se. It isn't mere sensory experience. It has something to do with common sense. It has something to do with conditions for the appropriate assertion of phrases in ordinary language. He's a little indistinct in specifying the source of the reasons for his knowledge of the premises of his proof. And I think this is useful. It provides us with yet another possible source that could inject justification into our belief edifice. It also will emphasize, I think, that there is a problem that hasn't really been considered yet, a problem that will rise to the forefront when we turn to Gettier. Namely, is it really the case that if I have good justification for a set of beliefs, and then I use those beliefs as premises from which I make an excellent inference, is that justification unproblematically and universally transferred through that inference from my initial beliefs to the belief that results from that inference? And it's pretty clear that Moore, in looking at the proof, doesn't think that that's true, even though he doesn't quite state that explicitly. So let's turn our attention to that first couple of bullet points in our lecture. We're going to start by talking a little bit about G.E. Moore. Then we're going to turn to Moore's conception of philosophy, and in particular, how Moore thought we ought to go about doing philosophy. And Moore thought that philosophy should be broken down into two components. We began, he thinks, with analysis. But the notion of analysis that is operative in Moore isn't the notion of analysis that a contemporary American philosophy student is likely to recognize. And so we need to keep in mind that Moore's understanding of analysis is different, particularly from the Americanized understanding of analysis that's prominent from analytic philosophy in the United States. Once analysis has been completed, Moore thinks we then transition into justification, where we seek to determine what evidence we have for the newly clarified propositions. And this is where we get the bulk of the work being done to establish the basis for the proof now that we've clarified the issues that the proof is supposed to address. Turning our attention to Moore himself, the first thing that we notice is that he went under the moniker of G.E. Moore, and he apparently professed to hate first names. Now, he was born in 1873 and he passed away in 1958. He was, of course, a British philosopher and a member of the Royal Society. He is probably best known for his role in the development of contemporary analytic philosophy, for his contributions to ethical theory, and for his defense of philosophical realism. In fact, he's sometimes described as Russell's co-conspirator, along with figures like Wittgenstein and Frege, in the development of British analytic philosophy. Like Russell, he led a rejection of idealism within British philosophy of his time, and he spent his entire career at Cambridge, where he also spent a significant period of time as the editor, the predecessor, in fact, of Gilbert Ryle, of the journal Mind, which at that time was a very prestigious and relatively interdisciplinary journal. For instance, Turing and other scientists sometimes would publish in Mind. He belonged to the Cambridge Apostles, which is a sort of quasi-secret intellectual society, and he served as the president of the British Ethical Union. So he led a relatively rich life, and he was actually fairly influential in society of his time, despite the fact that he wasn't exactly an outgoing person outside of the confines of academia.